all right? I want to harness it, okay? Seriously, I wanna organize it. All right, we can't keep operating like this. We gotta see. Guys, a C stands for chaos. That can't happen again.
What makes for a good war movie, in my opinion, is a film's ability to successfully illustrate small, beautiful moments amongst the horror and grime of warfare. Those brief glimmers of true humanity peppered against the backdrop of violence that remind us that there's something driving these soldiers forward. Something real, something universal, something other than the action. Alternatively, a war movie's plot driven forward solely by action can often feel hollow and sometimes even inappropriate. These kinds of war movies are selling neatly packaged, sexy, and stylistic gratuity. In other words, fantasy. Ugly, sometimes chaotic, and often boring. That's the reality. And some of the most compelling films made on the topic of warfare, particularly in the modern sphere, embrace these themes. Ordinary people tasked with an extraordinary undertaking, and the sometimes painfully normal moments that color their lives in between the gunfire. Working back of house in a commercial kitchen is not tantamount to warfare, but it is work that could be described generally as ugly, sometimes chaotic, and yes, often boring. This is the power of Hulu's The Bear, a series that, in its first season, uses the bleak kitchen reality as a backdrop for a surprisingly effective family drama. In The Bear, Carmen "Carmy" Berzato, an accomplished chef of James Beard Award pedigree, returns to Chicago to run the original Beef of Chicagoland, a dilapidated but iconic Italian beef joint that was previously owned by his brother Michael, who bequeaths the beef to Carmy before committing suicide. Brief references to the fine dining opulence of Carmy's past life flash by in both whisper tone and sneering dismissiveness by the staff at the Beef. In one vignette, we get a glimpse into the world that Carmy left behind, a brightly lit, perfectly manicured kitchen that seemingly operates like clockwork. Carmy's former boss haunts around the kitchen, impressing controlled and intense verbal abuse upon his staff. This scene ends with Carmy blankly contemplating his boss's offering that he should be dead. The camera lingers on Carmy's expressionless eyes for a moment before cutting back to the Beef. Carmy is hastily wrapping a greasy sandwich on top of a counter covered in oil-stained order tickets while screaming for help at his still indifferent staff. We glance around the kitchen. Stations are covered in dripping egg and unfinished prep work. Globs of sauce cover the floor. While the abuse that Carmy endured in fine dining was perhaps emotionally ugly, here we see the visceral, physical ugliness of a kitchen in chaos. This is an all too familiar reality of accessible food service. Small, quiet victories appear throughout Season 1, but they occur rarely and without pretense. Marcus realizes his passion for baking and leans wholly into his work. Sydney borrows from her own past to implement quick thinking and earn respect as a leader. Tina rediscovers a love for the kitchen after being inspired by both Carmy and Sydney, who she comes to deeply respect in spite of her initially intense aversion to change. These moments depict the glimmers of hope that these characters feel throughout the series, but that hope for the most part is measured, tempered. A great review for Sydney's untested dish brings in several interested customers. It doesn't earn the Beef a Michelin star. Marcus develops a donut recipe throughout the season. His efforts are rewarded initially by Carmy's angry destruction of the pastry, but ultimately culminate in a compliment and an apology. We presume that Marcus won't be appearing on the Great British Bake Off anytime soon. These are creative people striving towards private dreams in an absolutely brutal industry that doesn't have the time to entertain ratatouille delusions. And those small victories, a regularly successful day, a positive local review, a stocking crisis averted, these are the moments that lend so much power to The Bear. These very banal, normal, and in some ways boring successes are what give the series such a feeling of kitchen realism. A friend of mine who works in the service industry said of the show, "I worked in Carmy's shop before. I've heard this sentiment echoed many times over by service industry people that speak to how evocative something like the sound of several order tickets printing with no end in sight were to them while watching the show. That feeling, that quiet desire for artistic validation, is a universal feeling for anyone who's ever made literally anything. But what makes it so effective in The Bear is the realism of scale. With the exception of Carmy and Sydney, none of the staff at the Beef have any formal culinary training. Marcus talks about working at McDonald's prior to his current employ. For the most part, this first season doesn't delude itself and us as the audience into an unrealistic narrative where the right sandwich will inspire a private investor to buy the crew the goodwill brick and mortar of their dreams. The culinary skills of the crew improve throughout the series, but not so much that we would have trouble accepting this growth. Menu improvements and the implementation of an organizational structure in the kitchen help to make things run more smoothly. But things certainly aren't perfect. Far from it. And at the end of the day, our crew is still working at the Beef. Until they're not. But more about that later. Each and every one of these people are trying to improve their small restaurant in whatever way they know how. Small, beautiful moments of true humanity like Tina's desire for her son to work in the restaurant, to learn what she has learned, presented through an unpretentious, earnest, but entirely banal request for him to do just that to Sydney. Moments that could occur in any small restaurant. Contrast this with the culinary fantasy of Jon Favreau's Chef. I really like Chef, but it's a guilty pleasure of foodie fantasy for me, not necessarily an effective representation of the service industry. The premise of a culinary genius misunderstood at his current restaurant and becoming a minor celebrity chef after a confrontation with a food critic doesn't feel in any way subtle. The Jon Favreau's Chef Casper then immediately launches a successful food truck and slings Cuban sandwiches that are so amazing that he gets bankrolled for a new restaurant by the initially disagreeing critic, and reconciles with his ex-wife feels simply self-indulgent. And this isn't a review of Chef, this is simply the vision of the culinary world that we've been given prior to The Bear. Ratatouille has a very similar narrative through line in that the vision we're presented with is ultimately that of chef versus review, artist versus critic. Unmessy, highly stylized, and all seen through the lens of the impossibly inaccessible world of haute cuisine, where by the end of the film, our hero artist is rewarded with the only sort of vindication that they could possibly aspire towards: financial success in the form of a big, beautiful restaurant. Well, that isn't the experience of most service industry people, and it's not an accurate representation of either fine dining or your local diner with the world's best cheeseburger. I truly believe that The Bear has established itself as the new standard for on-screen service industry greatness in a way that's going to be hard to top. I have one concern: the ending. Season 1 of The Bear concludes with Carmi's discovery that Michael somehow squirreled away hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash within the tomato cans that lined a back wall in the kitchen. This narrative decision marks the single greatest departure from reality that the series has been guilty of so far, and notably represents what feels like something of a soft reboot of a story still in its fledgling year. Now presumably free of the financial burden of Michael's restaurant, Carmi and friends close the beef to make room for a new restaurant. I won't say too much about what may or may not come in the second season of this show because it's simply unknowable. I'll leave you with this to ponder. Will a departure from the dirty counters, the oil-stained tickets, the beautifully normal mess of an any town in America greasy spoon like the beef render too much flavor out of The Bear? Time will tell. Till then, I'll be reveling in the painfully normal, profoundly compelling moments that color the lives of the talented crew of Chicago's original beef. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, leave a like or comment before you go. It goes a long way towards helping me out. More film stuff to come.